Buenas noches a todas, todos y todes. Desde la Cátedra UNESCO de Igualdad de Género de la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, les damos la bienvenida a la tercera sesión de las Clases Magistrales de Igualdad de Género 2020. Esta es la tercera y última sesión, titulada Transforming Our Sexual Lives. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the UNESCO Book Lectures on Gender Equality. This is the third and final lecture, Transforming Our Sexual Lives. A very special thank you to Professor Alcoff for giving the UNESCO Book Lectures on Gender Equality. I cannot stress enough how grateful we are to have you here with us tonight. Antes de iniciar, quiero señalar que una vez que la profesora Alcoff termine su conferencia, recién empezaremos con las preguntas y pueden escribir sus preguntas en el chat y nosotros las leeremos. Pueden escribirlas en español o en inglés. Si lo hacen en español, podemos ayudarlos con la traducción. Before we start, I want to point out that once Professor Alcoff finishes her lecture, you can write your questions in the chat and we will read them to her. The idea is that you do it in English, but if you need help with translation, you could do it in Spanish and we will help you. Lo último que quisiera agregar antes de iniciar es un agradecimiento especial a las personas que nos vienen acompañando a lo largo de estas jornadas que iniciaron hace 3 semanas. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos y por compartir con nosotros, y a las personas que vienen por primera vez a la conferencia de hoy, les doy la bienvenida y les agradezco por participar con nosotros. A lo largo de las sesiones que hemos tenido, hemos reflexionado sobre diversos temas, los desafíos que enfrentan las sobrevivientes de violencia en los medios, en los tribunales. Hemos hablado de la noción de consentimiento, lo que ella implica, la importancia de entender por qué las personas consienten y bajo qué condiciones se da el consentimiento, pues a veces puede ocultar formas estructurales de coacción, ¿no? Entonces el día de hoy vamos a pasar a repensar la idea de nuestra vida sexual en su totalidad para así poder reducir la violencia sexual. Entonces este es un breve resumen para quienes recién nos acompañan. Y now we can start with Professor Alcoff. Thank you very much to everyone.
I want to thank Aranza for all of her hard work in setting this up. It's been a very interesting several night sessions for me. The questions and answers have been very useful for my thinking on the subject, and I look forward to more discussion tonight. Tonight, I'm going to move to the topic of transforming our sexual lives. I've talked about the challenges of speaking out as a survivor, the issues of complexity with the concept of consent. But tonight, I want to broaden the topic to the issue of our sexual lives in general. And this presupposes the idea that we cannot keep the topic of rape separate from the topic of our sexual lives. To change the epidemic of rape, sexual violence, sexual harassment in the lives of so many people around the world requires that we think about our practices and our ideas around sexuality in general. What's considered normal sex in almost every community can involve coercion, it can involve a certain kind of pressure, a kind of emotional blackmail, a kind of structural coercion. And so what is taken to be morally blameless or morally harmless sex is sometimes overlapping with what we would call sexual coercion. So we need to look at why this is and how our sexual lives in general are affected by ideologies, gender ideologies, and others that affect the formation of will, of our desires, and our pleasures. There are many different differences in forms of desire, as we know, not simply in the objects of our desire, not simply in what or who we desire, but also in the form of our desire. And one question is, how should we treat these differences? So I'm going to develop a concept of sexual subjectivity that I think will help us illuminate the problem of sexual violence, but also will allow for a sexual pluralism, or the acceptance of a diversity of forms of desire. But I'm going to argue that sexual pluralism does not require that we set aside moral judgment or political judgment of any sort. We can still engage in moral debate and moral analysis and moral judgment of desires, of practices, of pleasures even, and allow for sexual pluralism at the same time. And I'm going to assume in this talk, and we can talk about it in question and answer, that desire is not a natural fact, but subject to social and cultural influences. And I think, what's confusing here sometimes in the context of feminist arguments and feminist movements is, and also pro-lesbian and gay movements, is that these movements for a long time have struggled to accept our desires, to affirm our desires, to affirm women's desires for sexual pleasure, to affirm the variety of desires that we find in human communities. We have wanted to remove guilt from our lives, our sexual lives, and we've wanted to remove shame from our sexual lives. But I'm going to argue tonight that while we need to do this, we need to go further than this. We need to consider how violence, and particularly gender violence and gender inequality, can become eroticized, and how we can transform our societies to affect not only sexual practices, but also sexual desires. So the problem of sexual violation, I'm arguing here, cannot be completely separated from the problematic of sexuality in general. The fact that sexual violations are so common is obviously related to what is taken to be routine sex or everyday sex or normal sex, the facts of pleasure and desire. So what we have to bring into the frame of our analysis is normal sex or commonplace sex or quotidian sex, as well as what counts as normative or morally blameless sex. What is the idea of sex in any given time and place that governs our self-regulations, that informs our self-evaluations, and establishes focal points of concern, where we are concerned about our sexual practices? And how do ideas about normative gender identities intersect with ideas about normative sex? So let me say first that the idea of setting up an evaluation of our sexual lives in the form of should statements and should not statements strikes some today as a very bad path to take. And I'm going to talk about the form of sexual libertarianism that's very strong in many places in the world as a reaction to faulty and oppressive forms of normative prescriptions in our sexual lives. We've had quite a lot of, for centuries of sort of bad normativity, and millions continue to suffer today because of the persecution of their innocuous desires. So some argue that we should not focus on desire itself, as needing judgment or as the focal point of, of normative or moral concern. We should just focus on the act rather than judgments of our sexual selves, and then we will be on firmer ground. And some people take this pretty far, so that you could have a desire, for example, for children, but as long as you don't act on it, then you haven't done anything immoral. So they want to keep desire from the realm of judgment. And this rising libertarianism in sexual politics is the result of the fact that social ideas about sex have been so wrong for so long that it has led to an understandable antipathy toward moral judgments and sexual matters. So we have begun, I think many of us have begun rightfully to mistrust our own capacity to judge the desires and needs of others. We also mistrust the experts. Many populations mistrust both the religious leaders who have, made their judgments based on sometimes bad textual interpretations and have enacted a kind of moral hypocrisy in some cases. So religious leaders are no longer widely trusted by large sectors of the population to guide us in our sexual lives. We also have reason to mistrust the scientific experts, right, who have claimed to take a more rational and more secular approach to sexual activity. They have also been guilty of creating pathologies about a variety of kinds of desires. There's still ongoing characterization of non-conventional gender presentations, trans sexual identities in particular, as indications of mental illness. This is still something that is debated by psychological experts. So I think the population at large has good reasons to be skeptical of religious experts, of scientific experts, and of ourselves, So there's a lot of this common view that just live and let live and don't engage in judging what other people do. So some people who work in queer theory argue that there is a kind of defense against normativity, or a kind of blanket or universal anti-normativity stance that is considered to be necessary in lesbian and gay theory or in queer theory in order to redress the wrongful judgments that have been made. And again, this has been because normative judgment, moral judgments, prescriptive directives have been a major source of oppression in many people's lives, also in straight women's lives, who are made to feel guilty for having sexual pleasures and sexual desires at all. And it's clear that when we talk about norms or guides, we are talking about the idea of what is normal, what is good, and thus we're engaged in a kind of ranking, a kind of excluding, and even perhaps a kind of shaming. And Judith Butler has developed this argument in a very influential analysis of the constitutively oppressive conditions of normativity. What she did was she, in her book, The Psychic Life of Power, takes Foucault's account of disciplinary power, of discipline, with Freud's theories of identity formation to hold that identities are inherently oppressive because they operate as norms. So any norm is inherently oppressive because it operates to constrain and to promote a certain idea of normal or normality, and to promote a certain kind of conformism. However, I want to unite with those in queer theory who have argued that we really need to open this debate up over the philosophical justification and normative implications of taking a kind of blanket or universal anti-normative stance. Norms and normativity have too often been linked or conflated by people who use Foucault's and follow Foucault's analysis of normalization. And so you have this kind of slide from the chastising effects of a discourse of the normal. Are you normal? Are your desires normal? To the idea that any normative judgment, any moral evaluation is going to be founded in this kind of ranking of people's, ranking of desires, ranking of practices, and thus it's going to end in a kind of exclusion and repudiation. But if we're working in sexual violence, as I am, you actually cannot avoid the normative, because the category of sexual violation is undeniably a normative concept, right? It requires judging sexual acts and also judging sexual desires. So there's no easy way to establish a clear line between harmful and harmless sex. What we take to be harmless sex may be the product of disciplinary norms, of cultural ideologies that eroticize violations in a variety of ways. So I think, as I argued last week, we can't avoid normative argument by relying on the concept of consent either. Some people think if we just focus on whatever consenting adults want to do is fine, and we won't go beyond any analysis, any evaluation, any moral judgment of what two consenting adults do, we can rely in this way on the concept of consent, and in this way avoid having to engage in moral analysis or moral evaluation. But as I argued last week, consent is embedded within structures that pose challenges, especially for low status groups of all sorts who may experience a kind of structural coercion to perform, to conform, to please, to serve, and so that they can maintain essential relationships, jobs, and so forth. And beyond the structural constraints on consent, as I also argued, consent does not really indicate desire or will. We may consent for a variety of reasons that are not about the desire we're feeling at that particular moment or the will that we have, right? If we were in a different situation. New research in psychology reveals that consent can be simply a means to avoid violence, discord, or the loss of vital relationships. So the norm that we are really after when we're looking at norms of sexual activity is something stronger than consent, right? It's something sort of behind consent. It's more like a willful desire that emerges from within an empowered position. So I won't go over all the critiques I made last week of consent, but I argued that it was inadequate phenomenologically, it's inadequate as a way to get at our will or desire. And it sidesteps the question of the social construction of our desire. So consent, I think, plays a big role in the rise of sexual libertarianism today. It takes the view that we can avoid judging our desires or other people's desires, that we should not engage in normative analysis of sexual practices, desires, or pleasures. And I think this is a kind of dodge or avoidance strategy that's really not adequate to a movement to try to make progress in our sexual lives. So if we cannot rely on consent, then we have to engage in the work of determining how to draw the boundaries between the category of sexual violation on the one hand and truly morally harmless sex on the other. And this brings us into the domain of norming sexual practices. And this means that we're going to be judging even those practices that are consensual or that may appear to be consensual. But then the question is, what criterion should we rely on to distinguish between benign sex and sexual violation? And this is no easy task. So what I'm going to argue here is that norming sexual practices should focus on this concept I want to develop called sexual subjectivity. And I've gotten this concept of sexual subjectivity from some of the psychology literature, some sociology literature, and it's also in philosophy, and I'm going to draw from Foucault to develop it. I think we can take a page from Foucault's concept of technologies of the self, in which the focus for Foucault, it's not about expressing our innate or our natural sexuality, but it's about making or fashioning a sexual self. So we're moving from expression to a making relation to our own sexual selves. And with this approach, liberation comes to mean less of a concordance with our natural or normal sexuality than the question of, are we able to engage robustly in the practices of making our sexual selves? So what's required here to really think about sexual subjectivity is an expansion of our sexual agency. And I'm going to argue, more than Foucault does, that we need to think about sexual agency as necessarily social and collective more than it is individual. There are individual things that we can do, but the real process of crafting new sexual desires and wills and practices is a collective process. It's often a collective process of experimentation in which there is an assessment and a development and trying out new things and open conversation and debate, as there has been in many sexual minority communities since the 1970s. That's what's really required here. So human sexual desires, pleasures, practices need to be understood on this view as malleable rather than fixed. They are subject to historical and social context. There's a lot of empirical evidence for this. They vary both synchronically and diachronically, meaning they vary both across time and across space. So we need an approach that remains open-ended. I think sexual pluralism has to follow from these empirical realities of the sexology research about the variability of human sexual practices and desires. And we need an open-ended approach because once we understand our sexual lives as embedded within history, we need to be open to the possibility of future transformations. We can then fashion norms not around object choice or sexual position, but in relation to agency and mutuality and care for others, as well as for ourselves, right? Because if we fashion sexual norms around object choice or sexual position, it would seem to close off the possibility of future transformation. So the way in which oppression and domination operate in our sexual lives is not determined, I'm going to argue, simply by the range of things we can do or even the range of pleasures we can have. There are all sorts of pleasures that we can have that coexist with our manipulation, our domination, even our trauma. In the literature of victims of sexual violation, you find this referenced a lot. So rather than focusing on pleasure, because I think pleasure is not a clear sign of sexual agency necessarily, I want to focus on our capacity to participate in the social, collective, and individual processes by which communities create sexual ideas, conventions, forms of relationality, and practices. And so the question then shifts from whether I have a sexual self capable of pleasure to whether I have the ability to participate in the making of my sexual self. If our aim is simply to allow individuals to act on their sexual selves, we're going to end up sanctioning problematic forms of heteronomy in which I am not in control of my sexual practices, in which I merely act out scripts that I have been given. So I think we need to shift from a concern with the discovery of my sexual self or laws that will allow for my full and free expression of my sexual selves. We need to shift from that focus to a concern with the practice of making. Is it possible in my society for me to participate in the making of my sexual self and the community's sexual selves? And this is going to be the way to direct our account of how to norm sex. The practices that then we need to focus on will be those that hinder or shut down these technologies of selves. So I'm suggesting here that what Foucault's work complicates for us is precisely the conventional ideas about how we achieve sexual agency. And in particular for Foucault, agency does not occur as if in an entirely free space outside of power or outside of discourse. And I think his approach is much more realistic in this view. So the concept of sexual subjectivity, as I'm going to develop here, drawing from his work, is much more expansive than the question of whether we can operate without constraint in our sexual choices. In that sense, I think it's more Foucauldian account than Gail Rubin's or some other libertarian readings of Foucault that focus on constraint. The libertarian view is that to have agency, for example, sexual agency, is to be free from constraint. But on a Foucauldian view, agency involves, and here's a quote from Foucault, the always present potentiality of the subjects to alter, unsettle, and invest the power relations that they are shaped by. And this involves having a consciousness about my sexual practices and being able to participate in the thoughtful formation of my sexual will or sexual self, the capacity to reflect. And Foucault develops this account, of course, by going back to the ancient Greeks, Romans, ancient Christians, and also he looks at some ancient Asian societies. And in this work, he explained that his concern was what he learned from this historical research that he did was that their concern was not simply with acts or practices that are permitted or forbidden, but with feelings, with thoughts, and with desires that one might experience. So, and this is the way he developed his concept of technologies of the self, or matrices of practical reason, which are directed toward the formation of the self or subjectivity that permit individuals, as he said, to effect by their own means or with the help of others a certain number of operations on their own bodies and souls, thoughts, conduct, and way of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality, unquote. So this gets us to the question I'm sure in many of your minds is, how do you create or transform your sexual self? How do you have an impact on your desires or your sexual will? So he's going to argue that it is that in these ancient works, it has been pursued as a kind of virtue practice in which you try to inculcate habits and you think about what your goals and what your intent is. And what he's and I'll give you some examples, but what he's particularly showing is how pluralistic and variable these various projects are. He calls them, he groups them under this concept of concern for the self, and they include things like the cultivation of religious modes of life, or the cultivation of a pious life, asceticism, sadomasochism can be included here, and other examples. So if you think about religious forms of life that call on you to be celibate, there's a whole litany of practices that one engages in reflectively, thoughtfully, mindfully, in community with others, right? So in this kind of odd way, Jesuit communities, religious communities of a variety of religions are precisely the kind of example that Foucault draws from in order to think about this idea of sexual subjectivity, technologies of the self, right? Technologies of self-formation that are being created through this very reflective practice of trying to inculcate in oneself some habits. So, but what he's pointing out here is that these technologies of the self are not technologies of normalization. You're not trying to achieve some idea of the normal, right? For religious communities, for example. Rather, you're trying to achieve a goal that your community has that maybe is not taken to be universally applicable to all communities. And you're trying to cultivate the ability to participate in a kind of expansive self-making in this way. So Foucault's principal interest, as we know, was not really in the end point or the specific goal in such practices. So he's not judging the religious communities or the sadomasochistic communities or the ascetic communities or the other communities in terms of their goals. He's interested in the practice itself, right? He's interested in the process itself of reflecting and trying to inculcate these habits. The mindful process of bodily engagement, and it always involves a kind of bodily engagement. It can't just be done in the mind. And he develops this idea by talking about his research on ancient Greek practices in which moral problematics, right? So the idea of a problematic is the idea of what's your focal point of concern? What do you see as a positive and a negative? And the moral problematics were not focused on the object of your desire so much as they were on the general mode of conducting your sexual life. And the goal was not an individual act or a feeling, but a mode of comporting oneself more generally. So his point was that we need to shift our concern about power, about the influence of power in our sexual lives, and our concern about agency. We need to shift it to a kind of meta level, not at the point of the actual choice of what we're making, but at the practices and discourses by which those choices come into existence as intelligible and desirable. So this is the way in which I think we need to rethink the idea we have of liberation in our movements against rape and sexual violence, and our movements for sexual pluralism in regard to the varieties of human sexual experience. When we focus simply on the removal of constraint or on negative freedom, we leave the historically contingent construction of sexual life out of view, and we diminish rather than enhance our capacity to quote him again, alter and unsettle the power relations that shape us, right? And I think a further complication for the Liberatory Project is that empirical inquiry, whether it's religious or scientifically motivated, is connected to streams of power. So one of the things Foucault suggests is that we look at how the streams of power are operating in any given practice and set of ideas. And the idea of removing constraints and expressing our sexual selves can be very much motivated by and linked to streams of power in a variety of ways in our society. So the idea that there is a sexual truth about ourselves that simply needs to be acknowledged or recognized and let free tends to render our proclivities, our dispositions as fixable or as fixed or as fixable with ever more therapy and ever more scientific treatments of sexuality. And that's what he's skeptical of. So if understanding the social construction of sexual experience yields no decisive conclusions about the underlying fixed nature of human sexuality, we still have to ask the question that I opened this talk with, which is, what of politics? What of morality? So if we follow Foucault's notion of technologies of the self, I still want to, as I believe does he, want to raise the question of morality and politics. In the final volumes of his History of Sexuality, which was unfinished, he turns to a transvaluation of ethical approaches towards sexual practices. And he uses these contrasting examples of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds and also some of the ancient Asian worlds to a lesser extent to suggest a way that we can focus not on the what, but on the how. So we focus our moral and political judgment, in other words, not on the what, but on the how. And this would be to follow what they did. And he's not supporting or positively affirming all the things that the Greek male citizens did. They were pretty atrocious in many respects. He's just taking out this one piece of the history. The licentious Greek male citizens were free, of course, to sexually engage with all sorts of partners. They could have sex with wives, with slaves, with teenage boys. Everything was game. But they had pretty strict norms about how it should be done. Object choice did not determine your moral status, but what was important was your sexual character. And I think we can draw from this the idea of cultivating an ethics of the sexual self. And what this amounts to in today's language would be something like a kind of mindfulness about one's pleasures, not simply that you are following a doctrine, but that you are enacting a certain way of being in your sexual self that actually is in conformity with the way of being you have in the society in general. And begins to get to the idea that this is not simply an individual matter. So I think if you're judging your sexual self by the way in which you're comporting your sexual self in sexual matters in relationship to the way in which you comport your sexual self in the agora, in the educational institutions, in the society at large, you're going to be moving from the idea of individual expression to a more social dimension of the self. But I want to also suggest here that he's putting a lot of focus on the relation of self to itself, right? What is our relation to our own sexual selves? And I want to develop this with an example in this next section that will help us see sexual agency as it occurs in real world conditions in present day societies. And this is taken from a book edited by Tricia Rose, who engaged a series of interviews with Black women in the United States about sexuality and about their sexual lives. And one of the women that she interviews is named Luciana, who recounts an event in her early life when she was a young woman that I think reveals her sexual subjectivity at the time, but also shows how it was transformed. Luciana saw a male friend that she knew, and she started hanging out with him. And then she followed him when he claimed that he needed to go to his place, his apartment, to pick something up. Since she knew him, she says, quote, "I didn't even think in that direction that he might cause me harm," unquote. Instead of going to his place, however, he proceeded to take her to a hotel. When she saw this, Luciana initially said she wasn't going to follow him into the hotel room, but he said to her, "Look, don't just sit out there in the car." And it sounded like he was concerned for her, and so she followed him into the room. And then she says the following. This is the quote. She says, "And like a dummy, I went in with him. And that hurt. It makes me more mad than anything else, not even so much that he raped me, but for the fact that I was dumb enough to have let him put me in that position. Of course, now I don't ride in anybody's car. I have very few dates. It still lingers. Now I'm kind of weird with all my friends," unquote. So what we can see from this is that Luciana is in dialogue with herself. She blames herself. She says, "That makes me more mad than anything else that I went with him into the hotel room. I chose to go into the hotel room," she says. And this is based on her reasonable belief that she had not at the time cultivated a sufficiently protective form of sexual subjectivity or subjectivity in general and agency. In hindsight, she thinks she should have been more wary. She should have been more assertive. So she's focused on herself, right? She's engaged in a relationship with herself. And her shame is directed at her own actions and decisions or her relation to herself. And again, this is reasonable in a social context where self-protection is the only form of protection that one can rely on, which is true, she believes, probably rightly, in her context for a young Black woman. But her subsequent life is then transformed by this determination to maintain a kind of watchful and cautious eye on her own responses and her own choices in every interaction. She's mindful, in other words. Reporting the rape or even disclosing it to anyone would bring about nothing positive, she believes. So she focuses on changing herself. So we can attribute Luciana's transformed social interactions and the change in her personality both to her assailant's act, right? It is his fault, his responsibility, but it's also to her heightened and judgmental vigilance toward her own choices and mindset. The internal direction of her vigilance reflects her fatalism about the possibility of protection. And I think this very common reaction to a rape needs to be contextualized to the specific norms or conventions of female sexual subjectivity against which she judged herself to be inadequate. And she found herself blameworthy for what she experienced. It's not that she lets him off the hook, but she's focusing on what she can do in the future and what she can change in the future. So it seems that she feels herself to have only two choices in this situation: perpetual wariness and restraint, or repeated violation. But what overdetermines Luciana's sense of having only this restricted sense of choice is this restricted scope of choice is the entirely reasonable assumption that no one is going to intervene, no institution is going to protect her, she's not going to be able to achieve justice. So it's not only the rape by itself that causes this changed relation to herself, right? It's the social context that protects rapists. So we can only wonder what might her sexual subjectivity become in a different context. So I want to suggest here that Foucault's idea of technologies of the self is useful here because it's based also on this ancient idea of arts of life, and I think it's also useful because it's critical in a prescient way of the kind of neoliberal self-management, the practices that aim toward a kind of coercive normalization. He saw the neoliberal idea of the self as evolving from modern ideas of self-correction or self-perfection that objectify the self as if it were any other kind of natural object that can be shaped and measured and evaluated. So I want to just highlight this as marking a clear distinction between the way in which we might read Luciana's self-transformation and neoliberal ideas of a kind of self-perfection or self-maximization, or today's mantra of self-actualization. In contrast to this, Foucault was interested in how the self constituted itself as a subject, not how it achieved some ideal of maximization. He was interested in the agential process of constituting the problematics of self-production, of how the self is understood, how one relates to oneself, how goals are formulated. In this light, he portrays the ancient societies he looks at as engaged in a kind of concernful self-regard that is less techne and more autopoiesis. It's working to improve one's habits and character without aiming for the achievement of a specific utilitarian outcome. So we can read Luciana's transformation very much in this light as a changed relation to oneself, as her decision to constitute herself in this wary, careful, restrained form. But we can understand that as socially caused, right? As the result of contextual conditions. So then what I want to flesh out in this last section then is this idea of sexual subjectivity based on these examples. And let me return to the issue of rape. There's a wonderful quotation from a recent book by Jay Bernstein, which talks about rape as a form of torture. And when he's describing torture, he says, the physical and the moral body are fused. What makes the effort of degradation possible in cases of rape and torture is that the human standing is compromised. It's conditioned from the outside. Our shorthand for this thesis is that first persons are second persons. So what is he saying here? He's saying here that sexual violations transform the self. Both victims and perpetrators are transformed, as well as family, friends, and social circles. Just the knowledge that such events are possible in one's life, however remote, has an impact on those who've had no direct experience of them. And what I think is important about Bernstein's point about the fusing of the physical and the moral body is that events such as sexual violations, as we see in the case of Luciana, act upon our subjectivities, since they change the way we inhabit our bodies, our neighborhoods, our families, our social networks, and our lives. Those who rape as a means to groom or season children into and adults into performing transactional sex of some sort know all too well that rape can reduce self-regard and it can weaken resistance if it's done perpetually, encouraging a form of bodily alienation that's useful for a transactional approach to sex. So I think the diagnosis that Bernstein offers that rape is a form of torture leads him to the very important point that the idea of the human status as inviolable, right? We're supposed to be able to experience a rape and push it outside and not be changed or substantively transformed in our sexual being. But this is not realistic, right? This is what rape does. This is what rapists are sometimes motivated to do. It's a product of mastery and domination over the living and the embodied being that operates through embodied violation. So the idea, when you think of rape victims, that they're just not strong enough to overcome the constitutive, life-changing, self-changing effects that a rape has caused on them, that somehow it's their fault. This is the mistake Bernstein is pointing out, that rape is a practice that works on the self, that changes the self, and that is often its intent. So what I want to suggest here is that what sexual violations do is they alter our sexual subjectivity. That is, meaning our capacity to have sexual agency in our lives. So as a concept, I think sexual subjectivity provides an alternative to the singular focus on violations of our consent. And our central concern with sexual violations should be their inhibiting and transformative effects on sexual subjectivity or self-making capacities. They're constraining relations on self-making capacities. And this can be thought of on both an individual and a collective level. Collectively, the epidemic of sexual violation that targets specific groups, trans people, lesbians, etc., identified, by their age or their gender or their sexuality or their race, constricts the possibilities for their collective self-directed formation. So I think we can find resources in this concept for a politically useful, open-ended account of of sexual subjectivity that will resist reification tendencies as well as normalizing, or the idea that there's one normal form of sexual subjectivity. And this account can then help to articulate the precise effects of sexual violation or of what has been violated without assuming a developmental teleology or that there is a single norm for a correct or a well-formed sexual subjectivity. The point is then not to judge how our sexuality develops, but how our sexual subjectivity develops or is allowed to develop as a practice of self-making. A central feature of Foucault's account is the idea that our erotic lives, as I said, are not hardwired toward a singular mode of desire. They're subject to radical alteration. And so the point is not to develop a developmental teleology that we all must follow, but the practice of self-making itself is the critical issue here. And I think it invites us to imagine simply not an intellectual attitude or a detached discernment, but to look at the practical activities of self-making, right? It's not simply an intellectual practice, it is a bodily practice. So in this slide, I want to end with 4 claims. First, a central way to understand sexual violation is to consider its effects on our capacity to become effective agents involved in the making of our sexual lives. Effective agency requires a sphere for exploration and experimentation and the hermeneutical space to generate our own interpretations of our experiences and our desires. So we can see the person who Tricia Rose interviewed, Luciana, as engaging in an interpretation of her own experience, a rational and reasonable interpretation of her own experience, but under a very small and constrained arena for self-development. Current practices of the self for many vulnerable groups too often maintain mainly exhortations to learn self-defense, to exercise daily routines of caution, to cultivate resilience in the face of trauma. The general orientation of this practice speaks of fatalism. So there's a lot of fatalism about being able to go beyond self-defense and caution, and a diminution of exploration, or as if self-regard or self-care or self-love can only be manifest, especially for women and girls, in forms of self-protection. So what we're aiming for when we aim for sexual liberation then is not simply a removal of constraints on existing desires, but an enlarged idea of one's relation to one's sexual self that can go beyond protection and harm avoidance. Such diminished agendas look plausible only in light of the epidemic of violations in context of social indifference. The second thing I want to argue is that the movement of survivors and our allies to denaturalize abuse, assault, and rape, and to formulate new languages by which we describe and understand our experiences is a way to rework the moral problematizations concerning various kinds of norms that involve gender, moral relations, and sexuality. So this is not to say that there's a uniform set of ideas and practices emerging from anti-rape movements. There's a lot of diversity around the world in anti-rape movements and what their agendas are. But there is a concerted engagement with existing norms, existing problematics, and practices, such as the practice of remaining silent in the face of violation. So the way in which we can understand these movements is that they're attempting to formulate moral problematizations that avoid self-blame, for example, on the part of victims, and instead place the blame elsewhere, perhaps on institutional cultures and general social norms, and not simply on individuals. Third, I want to urge against taking the concept of consent as a sufficient standalone criterion of violation. And some might argue that given the sorts of problems with the concept I've discussed, we could expand it, right? Which is an effort many are taking today. If consent is insufficient, we can expand the definition to something like authentic consent. But I think that building in all that we need into the concept of consent moves it too far away from the everyday meaning of the term. For the concept of authentic consent would have to address more than whether a person says yes or declines to say no. So I've argued that the better approach is to take this more expansive notion of sexual subjectivity and understand this as including consent as well as desire, pleasure, will, and most importantly, one's concernful and reflective capacity for agential self-making. And fourth, I want to argue that we might take up the concept of sexual subjectivity in relation to an art of existence to ask for both victims and others, what practices of the self might we imagine as helpful correctives in this moment? And what forms of self-cultivation are possible beyond self-protection? Posing these questions, I think, helps to restore a fuller sense of agency in relation to our sexual lives. And I'd suggest it will also help the larger publics to see that what is happening in youth cultures, in activism of young people, young women in many countries, and social resistance communities of all sorts are all part of the attempt not to police sexuality, but to cultivate the conditions in which new forms of sexuality can be invented. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Alcoff, for your talk. So we can start with the questions now. I encourage everyone to write your questions in the chat. I'll start with the first one. So this is from Carmen Rosa Guevara. She says, hello, and thank you for this opportunity. Is sexual behavior determined by genetics, or is it largely modeled by the environment?
I think the evidence that we have at this point is that it is not caused by genetics. There's ongoing research about particularly gay sexuality, and there's some people who are looking at what they call the gay brain to try to see if there's some kind of genetic basis or correlate that's a physiological correlate to same-sex desire. And I think we have to support this research. We have to let it continue. But there is a lot of evidence that for maybe not for everybody, but for many people who engage in same-sex sex, for example, there is fluidity in their lives. So they may be heterosexual until the age of 35 and then express a different form of sexuality. They may go back and forth. There's a lot of variability. And that gives strong reasons to think that the social conditions are more important than any kind of genetic determinism. One way that researchers have of making sense of this variability is to say that human beings, like perhaps I think there are evidence that there's other animals in this domain, that human beings, the sexuality of human beings can be expressed in the Kinsey scale, which runs from 0 to 6. So you have 7 actually possible categories of sexual expression. From 0, which is somebody who only achieves sexual pleasure in relationships with people of different sex, and 6 would be people who only achieve sexual pleasure in sexual relationships with people of the same sex. So you have those two kind of extremes on the end, but you have a range of people all the way from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories of human beings that experience some variability, some fluidity in their lives. And the Kinsey scale is controversial, and there's ongoing debate about its utility. But what it allows us to do is to find a way to accommodate the evidence we have that there are people whose experience of their sexual lives is a 0. There are people whose experience of their sexual lives is a 6. There's not a whole lot of range of motion there. But there's also a lot of people whose experience of their sexual lives has some variability and some fluidity. So this isn't a genetic explanation necessarily, but it is an argument that the nature of human sexuality is includes a lot of variability and a lot of fluidity. That's part of the feature of human sexuality. Then what we do with this is we can look at social conditions, how much homophobia and heterosexism is in your society. Are you living in a same-sex environment, a military environment, prison, a religious institution in which it's the only opportunities you have for sexual activity is with people of the same sex? Those social conditions, those institutional contexts can then be determinate over how your sexuality expresses itself, right? So again, this is not a genetic characterization. It's a characterization that human sexuality has a natural variability and fluidity to it, and it is the social conditions and the social ideas that can play a determinate role in how your sexuality, for those who are in categories 1 to 5, actually manifests itself. So I think, we don't need to ignore the whole domain of the work and the research and the sciences. It's very important for humanists to be in conversation with social scientists, to be in conversation with the biological scientists who are researching all of this material. We have to be aware that until very, 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 very recently, most of this research was compromised by ideological assumptions that were operating in the research. It wasn't until the 1990s that researchers on animals and insects began to really look and see what was happening in the animal world and what was happening in the insect world. And now we know there are over 450 species of animals and insects that engage in same-sex sex in a regular way. So we need to do that empirical research. We also need to be ongoing, reflective, and critical about what assumptions may be operating in the scientific work. So I'm not opposed to any kind of genetic explanations, but at this point, we don't have reason to believe that our genetic makeup determines us to be sexual in only one specific way. And, if you think about, people think, well, you have to have heterosexual sex to reproduce the species. Most of our sex is not reproductive, right? the vast majority of human sexual experiences are not reproductive, and most of the time we try very hard not to have reproductive sex. We're having sex for pleasure, we're having sex to express love, we're having sex to have intimacy with others. There's a variety of reasons human beings have to have sex. So the reproductive necessity of the species does not constrain, in fact, our the variety of sexual experiences that we pursue.
Thank you very much. Now I have another one. It's from Aurora Bustos Arellano. So she says, thank you so much again for this series of talks. I have learned so much. I would like to ask you, what do you think about Mari Nicola's claim that rape is a kind of dehumanization, in the sense that besides the physical and sexual harm, sexual violence sets back the legitimate human interests of victims? Yeah.
Yes, I think it's a very important claim. There are dangers in, as I was trying to talk about in this paper tonight, there's a danger sometimes in diminishing the impact of rape on subjectivity. And sometimes, because many of the victims of rape are female, social ideas about women being more emotional are used to explain the impact that rape has on women. And in that way, in some ways, blaming women for lifelong trauma, for lasting physical effects, the variety of kinds of physical effects that rape victims have. And rather than seeing it as the sort of natural result of the practice of rape. So I very much want to agree with the idea that rape is a form of dehumanization, but I want to give some qualifications to that. I think what I like about Jay Bernstein's analysis that I was drawing from is that we can understand rape as going down to the very core of the self, as impacting the self. Now, two qualifications I would give there. One is that the impact of rape trauma is affected by social context. So that's why when it happens to children, it can have more of a lasting impact than it does when it happens to adults, who an adult can interpret it, can analyze it, can understand that they are not to blame, that the blame belongs to the perpetrator, that there's nothing that they themselves did to cause this to happen, right? So an adult has, in some ways, more tools to understand and to deal with the trauma. But adults are also in varied circumstances. Some of us are in a situation where we can talk to somebody about it, a friend, a family member, and get support and get help. And other people are in situations where they have no one who they can talk to help make sense of it in their lives. And so it can have more of an impact, and the traumatic after effects can be stronger and last longer for people who are in communities and social situations where they can't reveal what has happened to them, and they can't get any kind of support or any kind of a sort of willing audience who's able to listen to you, try to make sense of this in your life, and try to understand its effects on you, because in that way you can avoid the process of self-blame, which is very common. So while I want to say that rape is dehumanizing, I think we have to recognize the variable intensity of trauma depending on people's social conditions, and the fact that the intensity of the trauma has a social and not just a natural cause, right? It is a social cause when the victim is made to feel to blame for what has happened, that she brought it on herself in some way. And I do also worry a little bit about the language of dehumanization. And this gets us back to the debate over the term victim. We talked about, I think, the first night, the term victim versus the term survivor that's used in English, and there's other terms that are used in other languages to try to think about victims as being able to have agency in their lives and not being reduced to an identity, like the victim identity, that will follow them the rest of their lives and determine their options and their choices the rest of their lives. So the concept of survivor is a way to signify the possibility of agency and the possibility of transformation. But most people I know continue to use the term victim as well. They move back and forth between these terms. Some people feel like they are not yet a survivor. They want to become a survivor, but they're not yet a survivor, so they don't identify with a term like that. So I think you have to let people come to the language that that makes sense to them based on their experience. And dehumanization is that may express more of what the rapist intends, right? The rapist intends to take away your humanity, but that doesn't mean that the rapist succeeds at taking away your humanity.
Thank you very much for your answer. Now we have a question from Maria Luisa Pastor. So she says, thank you so much for this lecture. How do you think consent should be taught? Or is it okay to even use the term teach? In school, sometimes teachers show videos about it. Respect is talked about. What would be the most effective way to approach it?
Yes, there's some very good videos on YouTube about consent. Some are quite funny. And there's a lot of good videos that have been circulated that try to teach consent as it's easy to do, to try to get consent. It's not a big mystery. It's not that difficult. And they're trying to sort of demystify consent. And I think that's really good for young people. But I think we have to be careful about promoting the idea that consent is sufficient. So rather than not teaching consent in these ways, what I would suggest is that a sexual education program would need to talk about consent, but also talk about something like your sexual self. And or if you want to use the concept of sexual subjectivity, to think about not just what you feel in the moment, but to also think about what are your reasons for consenting, right? So, and not just about getting consent from somebody else, but also being aware of why they may be consenting, right? So that if you take the consent, if you are, say, the male, in this kind of typical example, and you ask a female for consent and she gives you consent, you are still responsible to reflecting on what may be behind her consent, what may be the structural conditions that are over-determining her consent, whether or not she has sufficient agency in her life to make a meaningful consent. So consent is a useful tool to open up a larger conversation in a sexual relationship or in one's own self, one's own life, about what is behind that consent, what may be over determining that consent, what do we really want to know when we want to know whether or not consent, and is the consent actually revealing to us what we want to know, which is what are the reasons why we're saying yes in this moment, right? Are we doing it because the person is emotionally manipulating us and saying, I will break up with you if you don't have sex, or have sex in the way that I want, right? And so you consent because you're consenting to the relationship. You're consenting to want to have an ongoing relationship, maybe that includes emotional relationship, that includes intimate relationship, and also maybe includes an economic relationship. So you're consenting to the relationship. And in order to do that, you're consenting to a particular sexual act at a particular moment that may not be what you would choose if the other elements of the relationship were not tied to that particular consent. So I think we need to teach consent as a sign, and then we want to talk to young people especially about what is it a sign of, and about taking responsibility in terms of our own consent as well as the consent of others, to reflect on and to try to understand what the consent actually means in terms of our life and in terms of their lives.
Thank you very much. We have another one. This is from Juliana Casano. So she says, thank you, Professor Alcoff, for this series of talks. I learned so much. When you said that the Rape Act transforms the life of both victim and rapist, what do you think about the transformation in the life of the rapist? Rita Segato, an Argentinian Brazilian academic, says that the Rape Act is an act to other men in the society. What do you think about that idea?
Yes, in many instances, in institutional settings, even male-on-male rape can be of this sort. It is an act that establishes one's own dominance, one's own subjectivity, one's own status in the group. So it's an attempt at a kind of self-making, right? It's an act of agency, of sexual subjectivity, and of a kind of self-making subjectivity. And in the research that Foucault does on the ancient Greeks is the same, right? There's a lot of proscription against having sex in the form of being penetrated. A Greek male citizen cannot be penetrated because that will alter their standing with the other Greek male citizens. But they can penetrate others. They can penetrate anybody else, right? A wife, a slave, a boy. So as long as they're doing the penetrating, it establishes their own identity. So I think there's quite a lot of that goes on, that is an intentional act according to certain norms and conventions of a particular culture, group, or society, a group of police, a group of a gang or something like that, in which there is a kind of a test, a kind of performance, right? It's not motivated by the spur of the moment or the momentary desire or will, but it's more calculated, it's more thoughtful, it's more reflective, and in some ways it fulfills this idea of sexual subjectivity. But of course, we can criticize it on two grounds. Morally, we can criticize it morally of the way in which you establish your own status and subjectivity is through the degradation of another. That's a problem. And also we can also question whether it's really agency that's operating here, right? Because in some cases the rapist is following the rules of the gang or following the conventions of their social milieu of young men and their situation, rather than creating their own, right? So they're performing what the conventions are required of them in that sense. And I think it absolutely has transformative effects on your own patterns of sexual arousal and on your own sense of self and your own understanding of yourself in the world and your understanding of yourself in relationship to other selves. All of these kinds of traumatic experiences impact all the parties in various ways and can be quite traumatizing. There's a lot of interesting research on whether or not rapists can change. And there's some good counseling programs in some prison institutions that have been formed. Some governments, like my own government, in the United States, wanted to defund all the counseling for rapists in the prisons and have defunded most of them. But for a long time, there has been counseling programs for rapists in institutionalized settings, rapists who have been convicted and are in institutions. And so there's a lot of research on what impact it has had and whether or not it can change. And it clearly, we don't have enough research. We need to continue to do the research, but clearly people have changed, often through coming to an awareness and a fuller understanding of the impact of their actions on the victims that they perpetrated sexual violence against, a full understanding of the results of that and the effect of that on themselves. So I think we have to be open to the possibility that there is that it is possible for rapists, and in some ways it's for their own reasons, right? It's not just because of concern for the other, it's also because that's not the person they want to be. When they have a full understanding of what it means to be a rapist, and what kind of agency they have, and maybe they had limited agency in a certain kind of setting over the performance of the rape. They were pushed into it in part. I think you still have to have individual responsibility, but there is the possibility of reflection and a transformed understanding of the self. And it always, I think, is going to involve a transformed understanding of gender, of masculinity, and of femininity. And that's going to be a necessary feature of coming to terms with the effect of rape, both on producing a certain kind of masculinity that we sometimes call toxic masculinity today, or aggressive masculinity, or the idea that unless you have the capacity for extreme violence, you are not fully masculine. So it's the production of a certain conception of masculine sexuality. And some people, today are asking, well, how did this conception of masculine sexuality get produced? Who created that? Did I have a hand in it? Is it in my interest to pursue? Are there other ways to define and to conceptualize masculinity in positive ways that don't involve this this kind of degradation of others and destruction really of one's own moral being.
Thank you very much, Professor Alcoff, for your answer. We have another question. This one is from Glenda Belén del Rosario. She says the following: if we agree desire is often, not, if not 100%, constrained by our sexist, misogynistic society, could we at some point reach an authentic desire without burning out our minds and bodies with a constant deconstruction of our sexual subjectivity?
Yeah, I wish I could be in person so we could have more conversation, but I think that's a very interesting question, because I think maybe what you are getting at is the idea of whether or not we might engage in too much reflection, too much self-questioning of desire. So the question then is, can we get to a point where we can just enjoy our desires and not constantly be engaged in a kind of questioning and reflection on them? And I think, I think this moment in history that we're in is a transitional moment in which there's just a huge amount of social questioning and questioning of gender ideologies and questioning of sexual morals going on. So I think we're in a moment where there's the need for a lot of reflection to because we're trying to overcome some very bad ideas and bad institutional practices that have been dominant for a very long time. So I don't know that our generation, mine and yours combined, if we think of it broadly in that way, can totally relax, unfortunately. But I think that I think it's very interesting to look at minority sexual communities that emerged in different periods in different countries. For example, in the 1970s, lesbian and gay communities, that many of whom decided that they didn't necessarily need to follow the conventions of heterosexuality. They wanted to be able to have full and free expression of their sexual desires, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the heterosexual conventions of long-term, monogamous, emotionally connected relationships would be the norm, right? That would be the goal of that everybody had. You just dated for a while in order to reach that monogamous, emotionally committed, faithful relationship. But that isn't necessarily the only way to have a good sexual life or a moral sexual life. So there was a lot of experimentation, and there is ongoing experimentation in different communities of having sexual experiences before marriage, of having polyamory, as it's called today in youth cultures, of having open relationships with more than one person, rather than the old days where you would have more than one relationship with one, with more than just one person who you were having sexual relations with, but it was all kept quiet and illicit and not talked about. Today, there's an experimentation in some communities with having open, multiple sexual and emotional relationships with others. And I think I really support these efforts at experimentation. And I like the term experiment because experiments can fail, right? So when we see these practices not as expressing natural human sexuality or our natural desires, but as exploring different possibilities for different ways to live our sexual lives, we can see that what's going on in a number of these minority sexual communities is a process of open debate discussion and social media, sharing of information. Sometimes it's presented as, a releasing the natural sexual desires that are there, but sometimes it's presented as a form of experimentation. Once we let the heterosexual religious norms of sexuality, once we push those away, what kind of sexual relationships are possible and are desirable and can work? And that answer is going to be different for different individuals and different communities. But that's the process, and it involves reflection. It involves seeing whether you can try out a certain way, like try out polyamory, and see whether it works, and then summarize at some point whether or not it actually is working for you. Whether or not it is working for your relationships, and if necessary, change to something else, right? And I think that's that's the sort of moment that we're in, and it'll be interesting to see in another generation or two what has been invented and what has come about and what form sexual pluralism takes, because I think sexual pluralism has always existed. It has in some cases had to be underground, but what will happen as sexual pluralism becomes more open and above board and accepted, but thought about, because it's open and above board, it can be thought about, reflected upon, debated, and developed in this reflective way by communities.
Thank you very much. So I think we have time for maybe 2 questions, maybe 2 or 3 questions. So, well, first I have a follow-up question that's from myself. So in terms of reflection, I wanted to ask you something very simple. Like, what strategies would you suggest for victims that want to reflect on their own sexual subjectivity, but do not consider themselves as survivors yet because of how, traumatized or injured you are? So I guess I'm asking about this process between being a victim and then understanding yourself as a survivor, and like what strategies could you suggest other than only like reflecting, or maybe reflecting in some specific way? Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think the one strategy which has been very effective for many people and is today in some ways easier than it was 30 to 40 years ago is the strategy of finding a way to communicate with other victims. Mm-hmm. So you might get therapy, and therapy can be quite useful and quite helpful, but there's a way in which talking to other people who have been through some of these experiences can be more powerful, because in my own case, I've been in many different support groups, and you find yourself, so you are an outsider to somebody else's experience, and you hear their experience, and it can be very painful and traumatizing in a way to hear other people's experiences. So you have to limit it and take care of yourself. But when you hear other people's experience, you can have quite a different reaction to it than you have in regard to your own experience. And I remember hearing many people talk about horrific experiences that they had, and saying, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know why I'm still having nightmares. I don't know why I'm still jumpy all the time and afraid to go outside. And you look at them from the outside and you say, of course, it makes total sense that you're still having these long-term effects. So having that sort of outsider perspective, you're both an insider because you understand some of what they're going through, but you're also an outsider on their experience. can change the way you relate to your own experience and can lead to a kind of forgiveness and understanding and patience with your own difficulty in moving, as quickly as you want to the next stage of becoming a survivor. So the support groups of survivors have been a strategy of anti-rape movements all over the world. They've been very important. What makes them easier today is that sometimes they can be conducted like we are now on Zoom, in the computer, with even anonymity and social media. So you can have access to people's experiences and have a conversation with other people, even while maintaining your anonymity or not having to be, in the same room with people. So it's not easy to do this. It can be it can be emotionally triggering and troubling and difficult, but it can also be a very powerful way to gain some perspective on your own experience and your own after effects, and gain some new understanding and often new appreciation and patience for your own challenges. And the other thing that's just very interesting is to find out how common they are. How so many survivors, and you can do this through reading the literature, the trauma literature as well. Judith Herman's book, which I don't know whether it's been translated into Spanish yet, but it's on trauma and recovery. That's the name of the book, Trauma and Recovery in English. And she looks at people who've been through war, soldiers, people who've been through natural disasters, and rape victims as all sharing a traumatic experience and having common after effects, common long-term, sometimes lifelong after effects that they have. And what it helps you to understand is that rather than being angry with yourself for not overcoming the trauma, that you can adjust. I used to have this problem in my faculty office because my desk was situated such that if somebody came into the office, they were between me and the door. And I would, sometimes get a panic attack because a person was between me and the door. Maybe the person, reminded me of the person who had done things to me when I was a child. And I would just get mad at myself for having this panic attack for no good reason. And instead, I decided, talking to others, to change my desk around. So I moved my desk. So instead of beating myself up, I just changed my surroundings so that it wouldn't prompt, the sort of psychological effect that it was having. And I learned that through learning to be kind to myself and to understand the universality of these kinds of reactions that we have. So I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but
yes, thank you very much. So we have 2 more questions. I'm not sure if we can fit both of them, but do you want me to read both of them so you can give an answer?
okay, and I'll try to be shorter.
Okay, so we have the first question from Melanie Bleti Mosquera. So this is in Spanish, so I've done my translation. So her question is the following. Carol, I'm sorry, his name is Polish, so that's not my specialty, but it's the Pope John Paul II. So I think it's Karol Wojtyla, something like that. Well, Anyway, so better known as Pope John II, develops a sexual ethic in his work, Love and Responsibility. The main idea that guides his thought is that people are end in themselves and not means. Therefore, on the sexual plane, they must be treated in the same way. In his words, the person is a good that does not go according to use, since it cannot be treated as an object of pleasure, therefore as a means. Do you think that this principle should remain and be the axis of how we judge our sexual practice and that of others? So that would be the first one. And then the last question would be from Lorena. So she asks the following: is it natural to repress one's sexual desire? If not, what are the consequences? I ask this because it's very common to hear that men who stalk or rape are sexually repressed, like as an excuse.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I haven't read that document by the Pope in a while. I read it, I think, a while back, but I think that it is a good approach to thinking about what we want in terms of moral relations. Sex, though, poses some specific challenges and difficulties to this, because there is an element of a kind of objectification and even instrumentalization in sexual relations that to some extent is inevitable. A number of philosophers have talked about this. Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir famously, but others as well. We're attracted to others as physical beings, right? We are engaging with others as physical beings, and we're engaging in activity that makes it possible for us to achieve sexual pleasure in most cases. So there is a kind of use. So I think what you want is the sort of idea that we don't treat each other as mere means. I think it's important to allow that it is not immoral to relate to other beings that we're engaged in sexual activity with as a means to our own pleasure. That is part of the nature of sexual experiences and of sexual interaction. What you want is mutuality and reciprocity, and never to reduce the other entirely to a means to my own objectives or my own pleasures. So that's the concept of not being a mere means. But we do treat others as means. We treat other friends as means to greater understanding, to greater mental health. We do get a lot out of our relationships with others in a variety of ways, and sex is one of them. But that doesn't involve that we have to that we're treating other people merely as a means to our own ends or our own goals or our own pleasures. I think the idea of repression is a very, very troubled, and it has a very troubled and dangerous legacy to it in regard to masculine sexuality. Females are supposed to be able to repress our sexuality all the time, to be the ones who control whether or not sex is happening in our relationships, to be the ones who hold back, who not, who can hold back until we're married or until we're fully developed adults or whatever. But males, there's this long belief that physically males will suffer if they are not able to express their sexual desire, and there's just no basis for that, right? There's no basis for thinking that repression has an adverse physical effect on males. I think there are so many ways, especially today, to explore sexual relationships. You can have sex with yourself, right? To have masturbation, which used to be terribly condemned and cause people intense feelings of guilt and shame, but that's beginning to change. That the idea that you have to have sex with another person, even if she doesn't want it, otherwise you will have this repressed sexuality, or that the repression of your sexuality leads you to force other people. It's not believable. It's just not believable, and it's played a very bad role in excusing violence and aggressive sexuality. So what I'm really trying to move toward with this concept of sexual subjectivity is this idea of not simply allowing yourself to do whatever you want to do whenever you want to do it. That's not liberation, right? That's not the ideal of sexual freedom, because that could be, it's like an impulse, right? It's just you're allowing yourself to give in to momentary impulses that may not be the product of thoughtful action on your part. So the issue of sexual subjectivity is to have a sense of what kind of sexual being you want to be, what kind of sexual community you want to participate in, and to do that mindfully. This is not repression, nor is it simply expression, right? So the idea of repression usually comes with the idea that the opposite of repression would be expression, but neither of those ideas are adequate to our sexual lives. And I think the concept of an enhanced sexual agency that involves thoughtfulness is a way to go beyond the idea of being able to simply express as a solution to inflated amounts of repression. So I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, so this is just a comment before I close. Mirela Quispe, she says, thank you very much for three sessions. I've learned a lot, and she just wanted to say thank you. Okay, so just to close, I want to thank Professor Alcoff for her presentation tonight and for giving the UNESCO Book Lectures on Gender Equality 2020. It has been an honor to share this time with you and to learn from your academic work, and also from how you approach these subjects, which is not always easy. And I also want to thank everyone, a todos, todas y todes, por participar de las clases magistrales de Igualdad de Género 2020. Sus excelentes preguntas y comentarios han promovido un diálogo muy rico y productivo, del cual creo que todos nosotros nos estamos beneficiando. Así que desde la Cátedra UNESCO de Igualdad de Género de la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, les agradezco por su participación en estas 3 sesiones y les esperamos en las clases magistrales del 2021. So again, thank you very much, Professor Alcoff. It has been a pleasure. I think we've all learned a lot. So I think that this would be goodbye. I know everyone is clapping at their homes since we're not in person. So I just wanted to say thanks again, and we can finish the session. And there's a lot of people in the comments saying thank you very much. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us, for your help, for this opportunity. So I'm very, very glad that we had you for these year's lectures.
Gracias, Aranza, and thank you for everyone coming and asking such intelligent questions. It challenged me. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I'll close. Thank you. Goodbye, and have a good night, everyone.
Buenas noches.